When on trial for serious crimes, it is common to try and grab at anything you can to see if you can avoid the worst punishments, and for some people that involves making up stories and getting tangled in a web of lies. A lot of the people we will be talking about today suffer from some kind of mental illness, but there is a difference between being ill and being unable to tell right from wrong. Only on today's top 10 list will we be diving into 10 separate cases where the defendant pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. From people who admitted to their lies and deceit, to others who were proven untruthful by professionals or investigators, let's not waste any time and dive right into the top 10 people who faked insanity in prison. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Kenneth Bianchi. The Hillside Strangler, which was later found out to be a pair of cousins working together, were Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. The two were charged and convicted for harming and taking the lives of 10 separate women and girls together, with Kenneth taking the lives of 2 others on his own. The pair started off by harming sex workers, but it wasn't until 5 middle-class young women were found passed away that the cases began receiving national attention and the moniker was born. After an extremely intensive investigation and the arrest of the two, Kenneth began to try and set up an insanity defense. He claimed dissociative identity disorder. He blamed his alter ego Steve for the horrific multitude of crimes. Luckily, however, a court psychologist, Dr. Martin Orrin, observed him and his behavior and found that his claims were untrue. After being presented with this finding, Kenneth agreed to plead guilty and testify against his cousin in exchange for leniency on his sentence. He ended up being sentenced to life in prison, with his cousin getting sentenced to life without parole. In our number 9 spot today, we have James Lindsay. In 1995, a girl named Emma unfortunately had her life taken by James, who was 27 years old at the time. During the trial, he did attempt to plead guilty to a lesser charge of culpable homicide, but this plea wasn't accepted by the Crown, so he instead did a 180 and pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. He told doctors he was a paranoid schizophrenic and that the devil had told him to take the life of a red-haired woman. During the trial, however, the court heard of a letter he had written to a friend while awaiting the start of the trial. In the letter, he stated, "I have a cunning plan to get into Carstairs Hospital and be released after 8 years. If I go to prison for I will get life." This led to James being found guilty and receiving a sentence of life in prison. It was hard to find a ton of details on what has happened since 1995, but I do know that for a while he was in a mental facility, but back in 2011 he was back in prison and facing a parole hearing, but I do know at that time he was denied parole. In our number 8 spot today, we have Vincent Gigante. Vincent, who is also known as the Chin, was an American mobster and boss of the Genovese crime family. Vincent was originally charged in 1990 for racketeering and was able to delay the trial for 7 whole years after pleading insanity. Of course, this was a claim that needed to be looked into and investigated, and it actually started all the way back in the 60s. Even before this trial, Vincent would sometimes be seen out in Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers while mumbling to himself in an attempt to appear as someone who is harmless, but certainly unable to be leading a huge crime family. Despite his attempts and the delayed trial, he still ended up being sentenced to 12 years in 1997. A few years after his sentence, he ended up facing more charges for obstruction of justice, and it was during this time in 2003 where he pleaded guilty and admitted to running this con that led to him escaping punishment for all of those years. He pled guilty to avoid a long trial and to avoid other charges, but also to help out his family as well, as his son could have potentially been facing quite a hefty sentence if a trial was necessary. In our number 7 spot today, we have Garrett Brock Trapnell. Garrett was a repeat con man and bank robber who continued to claim insanity when it came to his crimes, which always left him avoiding prison time, and he continually found himself in mental facilities instead. He would frequently claim to be suffering from schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder, which used to be referred to as multiple personality disorder. Garrett's escapades finally came to a close, however, in 1972 after his largest crime, which was hijacking an airplane. He smuggled a pistol on board Trans World Airlines Flight Number 2 from Los Angeles to New York. He demanded $300,000 in cash, which would be used to recoup his losses after a recent court case, the prison release of Angela Davis, as well as another friend of his who was incarcerated, and finally he also asked for a formal pardon from the president at the time, Richard Nixon. In the end, no one was hurt except for him, and at the trial for the hijacking he once again pleaded insanity and claimed that an alter ego of his called Greg Ross was actually responsible. Well, unlucky for him, the prosecution had obtained a videotape of him him that was recorded a few months before the trial, where he was caught bragging about how great he was at faking insanity. The jury in this trial was hung, but at his retrial 4 months later, he was convicted and sentenced to life. He also tried to escape prison, but we'll save that story for another video. In our number 6 spot today, we have Gary Hilton. Gary Hilton has a story that is unlike the others on this list today. In 1989, Gary faked a mental illness in order to be sent to the Colorado Mental Health Institute instead of being sent to prison after he committed crimes of robbery and kidnapping. That has been pretty common on today's list, but here's where things get switched up. In 2012, Gary began to speak out about how he can't get out of the center, claiming that they're forcing him to divulge his crimes that he hasn't been charged for. Since 1989, Gary has been to different facilities with different security levels, one time even being allowed to live off grounds before being investigated in a serious crime, to which he was cleared, but then he was arrested for harming someone in jail. He is now being held in a high security ward at the hospital due to him refusing to participate in the part of his treatment that would have him discuss his criminal history. Despite admitting to faking some of his symptoms, he still cannot seem to achieve the results he is looking for. In our number 5 spot today, we have Erik Contreras. On August 15th, 2013, Erik was seen by multiple witnesses entering a Wawa around midnight and demanding money from the clerk. Just a few short days later, more witnesses saw him head into a pet supply store where he threatened employees and demanded cash. It was after this second time that he was caught while attempting to run away. While on trial, he tried to claim that he was suffering from dissociative disorder during the robberies and that he didn't even know he was committing them. The judge, however, not only didn't buy this story, but Erik also had a criminal history that dated back to 1991 that included burglary, theft, child endangerment, and drug crimes, and mental illness had never once been brought up in these cases. It is possible that the illness had been recently diagnosed or exacerbated, but Erik was sentenced to 8 to 16 years in a state prison and was also put on notice that if he gets convicted again of a future crime, that he could potentially be facing a life sentence due to the 3-strike law in Pennsylvania. In our number 4 spot today, we have Ray Routh. In February of 2013, Chris Kyle, who is a former Navy SEAL and author of American Sniper, and his friend Chad Littlefield, who worked with helping veterans, took Eddie out to a shooting range after Eddie's mother approached Chris asking for help. Eddie was experiencing some difficulties after his time in the Marines, and so Chris and Chad were taking him out to a shooting range because they believed it had therapeutic values. Unfortunately, this is where Eddie opened fire on both of them and took the lives of both Chris and Chad. This is one on this list that isn't quite so black and white, as Eddie does suffer from some forms of mental illness, but it's having to prove if his mental illness got in the way of him being able to tell right from wrong. Eddie claimed schizophrenia and PTSD, but professionals said that it was more likely paranoid personality disorder that was exacerbated by drug use. At the time of the crime, Eddie was quite intoxicated as well, and it was believed that this had more to do with the crimes rather than his mental illness. In this case, the jury deliberated only for 3 short hours before returning with a verdict of guilty and a sentence of life without parole. In our number 3 spot today, we have Brady. Between July of 1963 and October of 1965, Ian, along with Myra Hindley, took the lives of 5 separate people. Both were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, but 20 years later in 1985, Ian ended up being sent to a psychiatric hospital after being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Right from the get-go of being caught, Ian has been trying to get himself in a position where he could take his own life. He even offered investigators more evidence in exchange for the tools to commit the act, which of course investigators absolutely cannot comply with. After another few decades in the hospital, Ian began trying to get moved back to prison and detailed how he had faked his mental illness the entire time. He said he was pretending and that he had used the method acting techniques of Konstantin Stanislavski in order to fool everyone. I'm honestly not sure whether or not I believe that one, or if it was just a ruse to get sent back to prison where he could starve himself to death. At the end of the day, he stayed in the hospital where he passed away at the age of 72. In our number 2 spot today, we have James Holmes. James is the man behind the 2012 Aurora, Colorado shooting that took the lives of 12 people and injured 70 others at the Century 16 movie theater. Shortly after the shooting, he was arrested and held without bail while he awaited trial on an accepted plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. I just want to make it clear that insanity doesn't apply to every mental illness, of course. James was severely mentally ill, but the court has the job of deciding whether or not that illness made him unable to tell right from wrong. That is what the defense has to prove. Things were admitted to the court, such as his notebooks and journals, as well as testimony from 2 separate psychologists who spent 22 and 25 hours with him, and both diagnosed him with a serious mental illness, but both also stated that in their professional opinion, he knew right from wrong. After a tumultuous trial, he ended up being found guilty. The jury could have given him the death sentence, but on account of his illness, they decided that that would be inappropriate. Instead, he was sentenced to 12 life sentences without parole and an additional 3,318 years. In our number 1 spot today, we have Anthony Montwheeler. On January 9th, 2017, Anthony kidnapped and subsequently took the life of his ex-wife, Anita Harmon, in front of multiple witnesses. After this horrific crime, he took police on a short, high-speed chase which ended in a head-on collision between him and another vehicle, which very sadly took the life of another man, David Bates, and left his wife, Jessica, injured. Surprisingly, however, it's not the trial for this specific case of his that I want to talk about today. Instead, we'll go back 20 years earlier to 1996. In this year, Anthony had been charged with kidnapping a previous wife and their son at gunpoint. During the trial, Anthony pled not guilty by reason of insanity, and he ended up avoiding prison, but was sentenced to remain under state jurisdiction for the maximum sentence, which was 70 years. So for 20 years he was held in a mental health facility, but 20 years is certainly not the sentence 70, so how was he able to commit these crimes? Well, in late 2016, just 1 month before these horrible crimes, he sat in front of a state review board and admitted to them that he had been faking insanity the entire time. He detailed how he studied books on how people would behave and how his previous defense of hearing the voice of his late mother was actually entirely made up. He even said, "I've been using the system and I'm done." Although a forensic psychologist found him to be a high-risk offender, a psychiatrist from the facility he stayed at testified that he showed no signs of mental illness and had been off medications for a year. This would make sense considering he's admitting to no mental illness, but I'm not sure if that makes him not high risk. He ended up being released from the facility and didn't even have to serve a prison sentence, and that is what led him to unfortunately being able to commit these atrocious acts. There of course have since been investigations into how exactly this happened to ensure it hopefully never happens again. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye! Angelo Buono, I don't really care. Spot today we have Vincent Gigante. I don't know either. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. I told you this one up.